Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One administrative announcement before we start. For anyone who needs interpretation, there are headsets here. If you just raise your hand, and we will give it, the interpretation is in Spanish and English. And also, for those of you who do not understand Spanish, Dr. Gillis's remarks will be made in Spanish, and if you just raise your hand, we will give you a copy of his remarks. If you raise your hands now, we'll start that process of where those remarks should go. Thank you. Do you want to say that?
Simplemente lo mismo en español, los que quieran escuchar interpretación al español, también hay receptores disponibles y vamos a estar interpretando todos los discursos. Gracias.
I wish to welcome you all to the inauguration of the Americas Project, which is the first substantive event to take place in the Baker Institute's International Conference facility. I want to welcome representatives of the Mayor's Office, representatives of congressmen, the members of the Consular Corps and the Dean of the Corps, faculty and students of Rice, ladies and gentlemen. The Americas Project was born out of recognition of the vital interests that link the countries of the Western Hemisphere together, and the criticality of a meaningful and effective North-South dialogue. As part of that dialogue, we conceived the idea of creating a North-South forum at the Baker Institute of young, emerging leaders from both the public and private sectors in Central and Latin America to discuss, debate, and provide new insights into some of the priority issues in North-South relations. The topic of this first colloquium is Trade and Reform, the political, economic, and social implications of free trade in America. I need not emphasize the importance of this issue in the future of North-South relations in the Americas. But this is just the first of the issues we plan to tackle in this pilot project, which we hope will evolve into an annual colloquium. Our goal is that the Americas Project deliberations will produce substantive results in terms of ideas that make a difference and to go beyond establishment views. That is why we are focusing on the younger generation of emerging leaders. We invited participants from a number of countries in Latin and Central America, and our participants range from individuals in the fields of culture, media, the government, and the private sector. There will be 4 closed seminars during the colloquium where the hard work will be done. First, the implications and consequences of free trade and reform, which will be moderated by Ambassador Chris Arcos, who is now with AT&T. The second seminar, Civil Society and Social Responsibility, will be moderated by Dr. Peter Cleaves of the Department of Government and the Institute of Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Third, the role of the public and private sectors, moderated by Doug Schuller, Assistant Professor at the Jones School of Business at Rice University. And the fourth seminar will deal with what needs to be done, and that will aim at producing policy options and recommendations for decision makers, which we will publish after the colloquium and distribute to decision makers. At today's opening session, we will have the honor to hear the views of the Secretary General of the OAS, His Excellency Cesar Gaviria. Tonight, Carlos Fuentes will give a lecture on the challenge of Latin America, and the colloquium will end with a dinner for the participants, of which the keynote speaker will be Henry Cisneros. As you can see, we have much work ahead of us. The Americas Project is a collaborative effort on the part of the OAS, the Greater Houston Partnership, and the Baker Institute of Rice University. We appreciate the strong support we have received from our partners in this collaborative relationship. It has been excellent. And in that light, it is my privilege to introduce Mr. Philip Carroll, the past chairman of the Greater Houston Partnership and president and CEO of Shell Oil Company. Under Phil's leadership, Shell has been a strong supporter of the Baker Institute. He is well known. He's a physicist by education and training, and he got his bachelor's degree in physics from Loyola, a master's degree in physics from Tulane, and his continuing education at Shell, where he's worked since 1961 in virtually every major division, rising to the very top as president and CEO in 1993. I will not go into the many activities that Phil is involved in and his external responsibilities, from the American Petroleum Institute, the Texas Medical Center, Baylor College of Medicine. We are proud and happy to have Phil among us. Please join me in welcoming Phil Carroll.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to be with this wonderful group this morning. Distinguished guests from Latin America and the Caribbean, honored visitors, fellow Houstonians, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Greater Houston Partnership, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you here today. I know as I speak, though, there's a gentleman in the audience, Mr. Michael Solar, who has worked so diligently and so hard on behalf of the partnership to make this conference a reality. I know he must have great pleasure in his heart this morning, and thanks very much, Michael, for a job well done. As Houston's leading business group, the Greater Houston Partnership has been the primary advocate for Houston's business community, and we're committed to ensuring the building of great economic prosperity for all of the people of this region. And having served as chairman of this group, I can assure you that it is very much what its name implies, a real working partnership between almost 2,500 businesses in this area. But in a broader, and I think equally important sense, it's also representative of a partnership between Houston and the expanding international economy, most notably, as the ambassador said, the economy of this hemisphere. Because like you, many of you, the Greater Houston Partnership views the economic future, its economic future, in global terms. It also views all of the countries of North and South America as vital elements in that future. Our commitment to this global partnership makes our joint sponsorship of the Americas Project, along with the Organization of American States and the Baker Institute, not only entirely appropriate, but in some ways almost inevitable. The Americas Project is itself fundamentally about partnership between all of the countries of the Americas, and a partnership that is grounded in a strong common commitment to economic growth through freer trade and investment. Clearly, I think we're at a critical juncture today in the history of the Americas. The successful integration of the markets of our hemisphere into a growing and ever more prosperous free trade area is, I believe, a very realistic goal. And at one time that would have been viewed clearly as an impossibility, and today it stands within our grasp. But the type of cooperation that will make this possible doesn't just happen. It's got to be created and it's got to be nurtured. And believe me, there are forces out there that don't want to see this happen. First, by fostering the personal ties between leaders, that leads to the trust that is necessary to build this kind of partnership. Second, by encouraging frank exchange of views on issues, even very contentious issues, of mutual concern. And third, we must foster it by working together on strategies that minimize the individual differences and that in truth maximize the common good. Together during the next few days, I know that we will advance our realization of each of these essential goals. And that is why the Greater Houston Partnership is so proud to sponsor this unique gathering, and I am so pleased to welcome you here today. Thank you very much. I hope it's a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's now my privilege to introduce the president of Rice University, Dr. Malcolm Gillis, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. Dr. Gillis became the sixth president of Rice University in July 1993, and he has done extensive work in his long career in research and teaching activities which have focused on fiscal reform and environmental policy. He has personal on-hand experience in Latin America and countries such as Bolivia. He speaks Spanish, and he is one of the most noted economists in the development field. So it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Gillis, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Gillis.
Good morning. Let me preface my remarks by noting that it was exactly 30 years ago that my association with Colombia and rice began. I arrived in Bogota in May as a very young tax expert in the Commission Musgrave Tax Reform Commission, accompanied by an equally young fellow from Rice named Charles McClure. And Charles did not speak Spanish. He and I were paired up together. I did, after a fashion. And I was pretty green in those days. My Spanish was pretty good, but I didn't know all the modismos and chismes and all the fine points. And so I would introduce myself as an economista de la Universidad de Duke. Duke. And then I would say, and this is Senor McClure de la Universidad de la Arroz. So finally, a friend of mine, Enrique Lowe, said, no, you see, you don't translate the proper name. So after that, it was all right. But McClure was forever after known as the economista de la Universidad de Arroz. Señor Presidente, los visitors, faculty, students, es un gran placer presentar al distinguido colombiano, señor César Gaviria, secretario general de Organización de Estados Americanos. El señor Gaviria ya mereció el título de hombre distinguido cuando muy joven. Él fue elegido alcalde del municipio de Pereira a la edad de 26. Mostró aún entonces todos los indicios del líder. En el año 1978, la gente del estado de Risaralda, es un importante centro cafetero, le mandó al Congreso en Bogotá. Muy pronto él fue nombrado viceministro de Desarrollo Económico en la administración del presidente Julio César Turbay. Llegó a ser líder del Congreso en el año 1983. 3 años después, el señor Gaviria manejó con mucho éxito la campaña presidencial del estimado señor Virgilio Barco, bien conocido hace años como alcalde del municipio de Bogotá. Más tarde, el presidente Barco le nombró ministro de Hacienda para dirigir las finanzas del país. Él, el señor Gaviria, mandó el ministerio desde su gran oficina, ubicada en la calle Séptima, con Séptima. Por casualidad, eso fue la ubicación de mi propia pequeña oficina, varias veces en los años 68 hasta 82. Allá trabajamos con Guillermo Peri y otros economistas colombianos en la reforma tributaria Colombia y otros asuntos muy interesantes. Durante la misma administración del presidente Barco, el señor Gaviria fue nombrado Ministerio del Interior. Desde el puesto de oficina, él tuvo un papel central en las negociaciones de paz, como el M-19, guerrillas bien conocido por su historia de violencia. Entonces, él asumió otra vez la responsabilidad de dirigir una campaña presidencial para otro colombiano valoroso, el senador Luis Carlos Cayán. Como sabe todo el mundo, Luis Carlos Cayán fue asesinado en plena luz del día por narcotraficantes en medio de la campana. En medio de la tristeza nacional por la muerte de Cayán, el Partido Liberal escogió como sucesor el candidato César Gaviria. Ganó el señor Gaviria. Inmediatamente el presidente Gaviria inició una política de reconciliación nacional, utilizando la razón cuando posible y la fuerza cuando era necesario. El presidente Gaviria tuvo éxito en convencer a 4 de los grupos de guerrillas a renunciar a la violencia como medida de expresión política. También en el año 91, Colombia, debajo de su dirección, aprobó una nueva constitución. Mientras tanto, la administración de Gaviria luchó continuamente contra los grandes narcotraficantes y derrotó el cartel Medellín. Además, tengo el gran placer de recordarles que la administración del presidente Gaviria tomó una parte central en los esfuerzos colombianos y latinoamericanos para liberar el comercio internacional. El señor Gaviria es graduado de la Universidad de los Andes, economista como yo mismo. Yo me siento muy orgulloso que por la razón de mi propia carrera de economista, he conocido a 4 presidentes de Colombia: Carlos Lleras, Misael Pastrana, Virgilio Barco y ahora César Gaviria. Ahora él ocupa el puesto sumamente importante, y esa es una palabra sumamente colombiana, sumamente importante, del secretario general de la Organización de Estados Americanos. La organización ha tenido gran suerte en atraer a él a este puesto. Mucho me complace y nuestra universidad es muy afortunada a poder recibir al secretario general, el presidente César Gaviria, hijo de Perea, de la Universidad de los Andes y sobre todo hijo de Colombia.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gillies, for your kind remarks. Mr. Gillies, President of the University, Ambassador of the region, Michael Solar of Great Houston Partnership, Philip Carroll, President of Shell, students, faculty members, members of the Americas Project. For the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, it's really a great pleasure to come here to the Baker Institute, to this first activity as a center, and to the University of Rice, and to be part of this seminar about trade and reform in Latin America, the Caribbean, and North America. And I am pleased to be here particularly because I think the idea of the American project is a very good one. When Eduardo Aguirre and Michael Solar and some of them asked me to come to Rice to be part of this project, I have no doubt that this was really a very important initiative. And I came basically to give my thoughts about how the process of the integration of Americas is going, what needs to be done, which are the main hurdles we have, and of course, how we can get through this whole process and bring prosperity to all our people in the Americas. The idea of integration is one that goes back to Bolivar. He was the first to call a Congress in Panama in 1928, to ask of an integration of the countries of the America, to defend America from the monarchies of Europe. And to that meeting, unfortunately, the delegates of the United States never got. They have a long debate in Congress, in US Congress, and when they were authorized to go, they never got there. Or they got when the Congress has ended, so they didn't have the opportunity to participate in this Congress. And the idea was revived in 1889 when an Inter-American Congress took place, and they created an office to bring down tariffs through the Americas. And in 1910, they created officially the Pan American Union. It's very curious, but almost a century ago, the approach to the integration of the Americas was not political, was economical, and was basically to bring down tariffs. That is the same we are trying today, a century later. And we had an organization created, the Pan American Union, to look for those purposes. Of course, that effort never was not successful at all. And in 1948, after World War II, they created, or the countries of the Americas created the Organization of American States. But Latin America, particularly, and even the Caribbean, took a very different track. They went to protectionism. They followed what was called at the time the Economic Commission for Latin America theory of dependence. Protectionism was the prevailing economic policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we had the Cold War. And democracy was a second objective. The first one was to defend the hemisphere from communism. And this brought a lot of differences between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US. We had a lot of unilateral interventions and a very conflicted language, all through the 60s, but particularly to the 70s and the 80s. Was a very difficult period. The OAS was trapped in this Cold War language. There were main differences in political language, many differences in economic language, and it was very difficult to work. I think the multilateralism of the Americas, the OAS and all institutions, only survived through that period. It was very difficult to find any common ground to do anything but just some technical cooperation. But with the end of the Cold War, almost everything changed. And first we had the Enterprise of the Americas of President Bush that was very well received in Latin America and the Caribbean. Was the first time that the US was saying that they were interested in Latin America and the Caribbean, not only politically, but economically. Was the first time that the US established as a policy that Latin America and the Caribbean were a main partner in trade and economic development. And after that, it came the timely call of the Summit of the Americas by President Clinton. And well, there, I would say that a dramatic change was registered. I wouldn't say that it happened in the meeting. It was just that was very timely called. Very timely called, and it was possible to agree to get a broad agreement on many issues, how to tackle all the problems of the Americas, how to confront poverty, how to work in infrastructure. They decided the creation of the free trade of the Americas to be negotiated by the 2005, to be certain that will be ended up as an agreement by 2005. And during the 80s also, was quite important how Latin America and the Caribbean reacted to the debt crisis. Until the beginning of the 80s, Latin America and the Caribbean worked only with protectionism, and after the debt crisis, and that after was clear that that model was not working anymore, was not bringing growth, was not bringing stability. Well, major changes came. A lot of market reform were brought to Latin American and Caribbean economies. A lot of privatization. Inflation came down from, well, we could say 1,000% a year to less than 20% in just a few years. Tariffs that were on the average 50% in the 84, 85 came down to 12% maybe as an average throughout the region. Non-tariffs that were very important between dependent countries, between 30 and 50% of all imports in most countries, came down to 5% maybe today. So there were major significant changes. Also by this time, several agreements of countries were brought. Several agreements between the Andean countries, the CARICOM countries, the Central American countries. But it was not until the 90s that really came the important bulk of agreements. Then came NAFTA and the G3 and the Mercosur and all the agreements of Chile. And this was really a new period in which trade was the main tool for economic development, for bringing more growth to Latin America. And I have no doubt that this has been critical to the increase of growth through the 90s. The 80s were a very difficult period for Latin America. We used to say that was the lost decade. I don't think it was lost. It was just a period of restructuring, a very difficult period to change to modernize the state, to do a lot of privatizations, to look even for new political decisions. Some countries change constitutions. Some countries work a lot more with more public participation. A lot of decentralization efforts were brought through the 80s also. So well, this was a very important period for economic and political change. How much trade grew through the 90s? Well, a lot. We could easily say that Mercosur tripled the trade among Mercosur members from 90 to 94, 95, 96. Even in NAFTA, with the problems of Mexico 2 years ago, we could find, NAFTA, the new trade, its value 1.3 trillion, which is really a lot, and it's about a third of the whole trade within that region. All through the 90s, the export from the US to Latin America and the Caribbean has increased at double pace, and it's the only region with which the US has a surplus. It's the only region. Export has been growing very fast to double pace, and I think estimates of the US trade say that by the year 2010, the exports to Latin America and the Caribbean will be more than the US, than the Japan and Europe combined, which shows how fast the trade is growing and how important Latin America and the Caribbean are becoming for the US economy and Canada. Export from Canada to Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 2 years has been growing 25% a year, which is a very significant increase of exports. Well, even with all the noise we heard about China, the exports to Brazil are over the export to China today. And Brazil has been in the past a country very reluctant to accept export from the US. Costa Rica is a more important market than Eastern Europe. And that is really significant numbers of how important trade with Latin America and the Caribbean has become in these years. Investment that was $6 billion in 1990 is today 35, 40 billion a year, which shows how much Latin America has changed for foreign investment. So the initiative of creating the free trade of the Americas really was to institutionalize something that is happening. Trade, the integration of the Americas, it's already happening, and it's already happening very fast. It doesn't depend only of how many agreements we make. It's something that is happening, that will keep happening the years ahead. And what we will need is to develop a set of rules and laws so that process can be handled appropriately. Because one thing we have to learn is that the process of globalization and the process of interdependence is going on. And that means we will have a lot more conflict if we don't find rules to handle that. We need more international laws to handle with that. Because if that doesn't happen, we will have a lot of more conflicts a few years from now, and maybe very risky conflicts if we are not able to find an international set of rules to handle these. And the same happens with the America, not only in relation to trade, but in relation to many other issues. Before going to all those other issues, I would like to talk a little bit about the free trade area of the Americas. After the meeting in Miami, 6 months after that in Denver, We had a meeting of ministers. 7 working groups were created. Those 7 working groups had been working or work with the support of the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Economic Commission for Latin America. Then came the ministerial meeting in Cartagena, Colombia. 4 more working groups were created, and once more that is going to be inaugurated only after the meeting in Belo Horizonte next year. These 2 years have been years for, I would say, for gathering information and making comparative analysis of all the rules of all the countries and all the agreements of the hemisphere. Has been a very important process of learning, of preparing ground for a negotiating process. Has been remarkably important for everyone. Many countries that were not prepared for this process have learned a lot, have put some of the brightest people working on this. And we are going to have a new ministerial meeting next year, next month in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. In that meeting, I will basically think that countries will talk about negotiation, the negotiation process that will be launched maybe only after the meeting of presidents in Chile next year, on March of next year in Chile, to agree of how the free trade of the Americas will be. It's not an easy matter. By now, I would say that basically everyone agrees that there has to be a new agreement. A new agreement. I mean, NAFTA is not going to expand, or Mercosur, or we are not going to have an agreement between Mercosur and NAFTA. I mean, what we were going to have is a totally new agreement. That totally new agreement will be what the economists say is a single undertaking, which means that every country has to accept all the rules, all the obligations, all the rights. It's not something you can pick, I take this or this. It's going to be a single undertaking, a binding agreement, which means the commitments of the countries are juridically valid. You cannot take it just as a voluntary, no, it's going to be a binding agreement. And it will have obligations for everyone. I think nobody can expect any more, and this is particularly important for small economies, that it will be not a unilateral opening of markets. It will have commitments for everyone, and basically the same commitments, only that, of course, the small economies will have maybe periods to adapt to the new agreements, and they are expecting some kind of fund of investment for certain areas. I do not know if that is going to happen, but I think the features of the agreement are relatively well known. I think most of the I would say, well, the other thing important to decide is are we going to go farther of the WTO agreements in some disciplines or not? Are we just going to ratify those agreements and comply with those agreements? That is other matter that is quite important. But anyhow, it will be quite a complex agreement, and we'll have most of the disciplines of NAFTA agreement that is the most expansive. Even some more will have competition policy, for example. That is something that we didn't have in other agreements, and no agreement in the world today has competition policy. I mean, even the European Union is just starting to work in competition policy. But I will not go to more details about this, and maybe will be, and one thing which is important, the fast-track authority. It's very important for this process that the U.S. Congress gives fast-track authority to the President of the U.S. I mean, the whole process will be really damaged and we will lose a lot of the will we have seen through the last 2 or 3 years if the U.S. doesn't get fast-track authority. It's not essential to the process that, I mean, the U.S. government can sit on a table and negotiate an agreement, but without fast-track authority, nobody will believe the U.S. government the government is serious enough, or the country is serious enough to go ahead. And this has been particularly clear because in the Miami summit, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico decided to bring Chile to NAFTA and announce a process of negotiations, but because the U.S. never got a fast-track authority, that never happened. So Chile asked for an agreement with Mercosur. It got the agreement with Mercosur. Now they are talking about separate agreements. Already Chile made an agreement with Canada. So the whole process has been undermined by has been, I would say, weakened by the lack of fast-track authority. And I would say, even if the presidents launch a process of negotiation, the presidents and prime ministers launch the process, if the U.S. doesn't get a fast-track authority, I think the whole process will be in doubt. But I would say that this economic integration or trade integration is not all we have to do. And I will say we will not be successful if we do not work in the parallel agenda that was agreed in Miami, and it's there. What is that? Oh, the fighting against poverty, to start with. I think the protest and difficulties that may come if the Latin American countries, particularly, not so much the Caribbean, the Latin American countries don't find a way to be more effective against poverty, I think the whole process may be in danger. It's difficult to understand why, but poverty, the numbers of people in poverty may increase a little bit between 1980 and 95 or 96. How that happened? Well, the 80s were years with which most countries had an important setback in total GDP, in total product, and public investment came down to a half, investment in infrastructure came down to a half, and of course in that period we had a dramatic increase in poverty, a deterioration of the income distribution, and only through the 90s this situation started to change. But even today, in 5 or 6 countries of this hemisphere, the per capita income is lower than it was in 1980. A very clear case, because we hear that these days a lot, is Guatemala, where even if they grow 6.5% from now to the 2000, even in 2000, they are just still a little bit back or lower than the level of 1980. That means why we have some social unrest in this hemisphere about these things. The other thing is, well, it's not true that reforms are the responsible of poverty. It's totally false. A lot of studies have come in the last few months. It was very interesting in the IDB meeting, the Inter-American Development Bank meeting in Barcelona a few weeks ago, that well, there is statistical data enough to be certain to say that reforms have helped a lot to change the tendencies of the 80s, that the reforms, particularly those that move some resources to the investment in education and social areas, have helped a lot to improve or to revert the tendency of deterioration of the income distribution. But anyhow, we should be certain that the problem of poverty is a very important one for Latin America and the Caribbean today, and that the Latin American countries have to learn a lot to improve social policies, to improve social institutions, to have policies that are a lot more effective. Even before the debt crisis, we were very ineffective delivering social policy. I mean, Latin America has even today, Latin America takes more out of the GDP as a percentage of the GDP for education than the tigers of Asia. And of course, there is no comparison of the quality of the education. I mean, we may be 4 years behind some of the Southeast Asian countries in knowledge, in math and science. And so we are really having a problem on that. The other issue is the environment, the sustainable development. Only very recently, I mean, back to December, we had a meeting of presidents in Bolivia. There we found a regional dimension of the sustainable development, because until that moment, all the institutions, all the agreements were global, were within the United Nations system. Now we have found a lot of things we can work together. A lot of institutions are working in that, countries are working in that, and I think we are taking more seriously the commitments of the Rio Summit of '92, and we are trying to do a lot more about sustainable development, although we have to recognize that we are moving, well, not in the fastest way. I mean, well, it's certain that no country in this hemisphere can say it's on the track of sustainable development. I think no country can say that, not at all, and we still have a long way to go. We have corruption. We have been working on that. We signed an agreement, a convention in Caracas last year, and we addressed some important problems. It was the first agreement on corruption in the world, and we are going to handle in a better way banking secrecy, the asylum rights, all these matters that make so difficult the judicial cooperation among countries, and we really hope that we can tackle better in the future the problems of corruption. Narco-trafficking issues that are becoming so critical, so divisive. We had an institution within the OAS that is called CICAD, and within that institutions we made the agreements. We made the exchange of information and intelligence and give some legal advice. But recently, in the last 2 years, we have been looking for more a political dialogue within the CICAD. And we signed an agreement and a strategy for the 21st century between all the countries, among all the countries of the Americas. And I think we are starting to move more to the multilateral arena to handle narco-trafficking issues. I think one stimulating fact was that 2 weeks ago, Janet Reno and General McCaffrey went to CICAD to talk there, which means they are really changing their attitude to the institution. Simultaneously, both were to the institution to talk about multilateral issues and narco-trafficking. And I stop here to talk about this issue because I am particularly worried about the very divisive issue it has become for the relations between the countries of the Americas. It's good to say that what happened with the Mexican crisis, well, I think it has been remarkable how Mexico has come back from that crisis, how it paid to the U.S., how it has increased exports. The exports of the Mexico have almost doubled since the crisis. And for most countries, it took a decade before to come back of the debt crisis of '81. Now, with the very, very important, or I would say very critical crisis we had 2 years in Mexico. Mexico is already on the market, it's already paying most of the money it borrowed. in that very critical period and never close its economy. The economy was really prepared for that process, and I think that means Latin American economy has changed for the good, and it's much better prepared. Of course, we are not living the euphoria we had before the Mexican crisis, in which we were talking about the miracle of Latin America and thinking that the road to growth was going to be straight-headed and no linear and no problems. No, that is not true anymore. We now are more realistic about our possibilities. It has been critically important that Brazil is on his way to growth. This is critically important. And I think we are a lot more realistic. And I am certain that the years ahead are going to be much better for the Latin economies. I hope we will grow on average at least 5%. Of course, for this, we need to have the good policies in place. We have done a lot of reform, but there is still a lot to be done in privatizations, in improving the quality of policies, in labor laws, bringing flexibility to the labor markets. A lot need to be done in many areas of the administration, modernization of the state. Latin American states need to be modernized. They were weakened through the 80s in a way that is dangerous. The fight against poverty is critical, and it can only be handled effectively by the state. The regulation capacity of the state has to be enhanced and improved. There are a lot of tasks to comply. So I basically think that that is we have a long way to go. It has been very clear in last studies that only countries that keep the pace of reforms keep growing. We can talk that the reforms of these years have increased the rate of growth about 1.5%. But that to grow more than 3.5% or 4% a year, that is where we are growing right now, we need a lot of reform, a lot of more reforms, a lot of more change. We need to invest 60 billion a year in infrastructure. The World Bank has said that basically we will need that. Is very difficult. We need to privatize that investment. It cannot be public. We don't have 60 billion a year in the public sector to invest. If we do that, we will have no money for education or social policies. So to have real money for education and social policies, we need to create an environment for public, private, foreign, and local investment policies. I think with these remarks, I can end up this chat, and I am really grateful to the university and to the Baker Institute and the Heritage Houston Partnership for this opportunity to be with you. I do really believe that this program is very important. I think we need people with not only with more knowledge, but with a lot of more commitment to this whole process. That is going to happen anyhow. I mean, the interdependence and the globalization is going anyhow. But I think it needs a lot of work and the best and the brightest people working for it, as it's happening in the European Union. We will have a different integration in the Americas, but anyhow, we need strong institutions to address many of our problems. So I think this is a very remarkable, and it's very remarkable that Rice University is thinking in Latin America, or in south of the border, as they say. And we at the OAS will be supporting this initiative in the years ahead, hoping that we will be successful on it. I want to thank President Gillis for his kind remarks about Colombia. The Musgrave mission in which he participated in those years was a very important paper, technical paper, and his recommendations have been alive for the last almost 2 years. And I do really hope that my country also retakes the path of growth, not of growth because it's growing, but of reform that is so important to solve the challenges of violence and insecurity and so many others that are in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Gaviria. You have given us the frame of reference that we need for our participants to start their deliberations today. We thank you very much for your substantive contributions and your support of this program. I want to welcome Congressman Kevin Brady, who is here from the 8th Congressional District, who has joined us. Thank you for being with us, Congressman. Now the hard work begins. Our participants will now go to the Founders Room at Rice University, and we will start seminar number 1. And thank you very much for coming. The program of the Americas Project is launched. Thank you.